Hello and welcome to week number 12 in plant biology here at NICC. And this week we will be reading in the Biology 2E textbook. So the OER Biology 2E textbook, chapter 25, sections point 1 and point 2. So 25.1 and 25.2 are the readings for this week. We'll be going over 25.3 next week. So chapter 25 is really this sort of introduction to the systematics of seedless plants. So we talked last week about sort of an introduction about systematics and why systematics are important and sort of where plants are fitting into sort of the greater ideas about structures of how science organizes our understanding of how organisms are related. This week we're going to start talking about plants. And we start out talking about seedless plants because they are the most primitive form of plants that we have. 25.1 really just sort of talks about the early plant life on this planet, and 25.2 really starts talking about algae. And so when we're talking about these sorts of organisms, we're really starting to build our understanding of the evolutionary path that plants and plant-like organisms took that eventually moved into the world that we know today of the plants that we see on this planet. Next week we're going to be talking about the bryophytes, which are the mosses, liverworts, and hornworts, but those would be the very basic really early land plants that we see. So we're going to be talking about these sort of early adaptations and life history traits that these early plants, we'll say early plants, have. And so we're again going through 25.1 in the Biology 2E textbook, and so we're really starting out and looking at these sort of early evolutionary adaptations to life in a plant-like manner. Algae, so these blue-green algae are really these early sorts of photosynthetic organisms that are laying these sort of biochemical pathways for life. Photosynthetic bacteria exists, and we've talked about photosynthesis as a process. And we've seen how with bacteria we can have photosynthetic bacteria without the discrete organelles that we have with the chloroplasts in plants. But we can still have bacteria that are photosynthetic, definitely not plants, still photosynthetic, so we're sort of laying that foundation to move forward evolutionary into these traits that we're going to see later on in plants. And so algae is not really all that different. Some algae are considered plants and some move into what are called the protists, and it really depends on sort of what sort of way you want to organize life as a scientist. And those sorts of arguments, depending on sort of which sort of pathway you would be interested in taking for determining what sort of taxonomic life sort of history you're interested in, is really sort of beyond the purview of this course. But it's important to understand that these are live and active conversations within scientific communities currently right now. So if you're interested in taxonomy, you're interested in how scientists understand where organisms fit with other organisms, those are live and active conversations. But for the beginning of this chapter, we're going to be really looking at these sort of early sorts of adaptations that plants and plant-like organisms have. And plant adaptations to life on land was a huge leap evolutionarily, moving out of these aquatic habitats. If you're in an aquatic habitat, you're competing with other aquatic organisms. If you can move onto land, you are now exploiting a habitat that is not being inhabited by any other organisms that are going to be competing for resources. These sorts of new and novel habitats are really what are driving evolutionary processes, not really with just plants. All organisms are evolving in response to new habitat types, but what we're talking about in plants is the invasion from aquatic habitats into land habitats. moving out of aquatic and onto terrestrial habitats comes at a huge cost to plants. Water is necessary for life, and if you're in an aquatic habitat, it's pretty easy to exist. You can diffuse readily, you have the sort of zero-G sort of environment to grow your structures, you don't have to worry about gravity so much, and also, if you're photosynthetic, you need light, but light is also a lot of energy, and that can be really damaging to specifically DNA. And so being in an aquatic habitat provides a lot of protection and makes things very easy and available for organisms like early plants or plant-like life. And so making this leap to land require the accumulation of adaptations to overcome many of these challenges. Desiccation, drying out, being able to survive in dry environments is challenging. Even if we think today the difference between, say, a tropical rainforest and a desert, the water availability in those places is fundamentally different. And so organisms, and specifically plants, have adaptations to meet these different challenges. Same thing was true as plants were moving from aquatic environments onto land. So with these changes in environments, we see changes in sort of body plans and structures and life histories. So we see mechanisms to prevent desiccation, so to prevent drying out. We see mechanisms and structures to prevent an overabundance of sunlight energy, to prevent that genetic damage. We also see the sort of strategy of living in moist environments rather than dry environments. Those sorts of evolutionary changes are important too. One of the major adaptations that we see with moving from aquatic habitats onto terrestrial habitats is this, what's known as the alternation of generations. And this is really where we get to see plants changing their reproductive strategies to meet these new challenges on land habitats. We also get to see the development of vascular tissue and other sort of structural changes that give a robust and sort of strength component to these new invaders, to this new habitat type. Okay, so let's start with alternation of generations. So alternation of generations is a strategy that plants have to have these different sorts of life stages for these organisms so that they can exploit different environmental conditions and continue to sexually reproduce and make sure that diversity within their populations is maintained. With alternation of generations, we have what are known as the gametophyte generation and the sporophyte generation. Now, when we think about plants, let's think about trees. Trees are a great example of sort of modern plants. When we're looking at a tree itself, that is the sporophyte generation. Chromosomally, it's 2N, so it has chromosomes from both sets of parents. Trees have a gametophyte generation. It's just very much reduced, and we see that as the ovules in flowers, and then as pollen. Those are the sorts of gametophyte structures that eventually fuse or are in place to give rise to gametes, where they fuse and then produce a new 2N individual. With the alternation of generations that we see, we have different multicellular structures for different goals of reproduction and development. This is a very different sort of reproductive strategy than we're sort of used to if we're thinking about, let's say, human reproduction. With human reproduction, the production of eggs and sperms are entirely really dependent on our 2N bodies, and that is very different than with this alternation of generation, where we have multicellular structures, basically new organisms that are involved in the generation of these gametes. And we see this in these early plants. As plants make this move to land, the shift from, I'll say, a gametophyte dominant generation, which we see in the mosses and the liverworts and the hornworts, to sporophyte dominant generation is really, again, this adaptation to these drier environments. All right. So with this alternation of generation, we have, again, this gametophyte and the sporophyte generations, and we have this production of spores in this sporophyte generation, which is a new combination of genetic material that is one end, and they spread out into their environments from the sporophytes or the sporangia that sort of are supported by the gametophyte generation of these organisms. So when you think about moss, again, where that green soft fuzzy stuff, that is the gametophyte generation. And if you look at figure 25.3 in the text, you'll see that the sporophyte generation is these little bitty stalks that are very inconspicuous, and you've probably never noticed them if you've ever looked at moss in depth, but those are this alternate life form where we have this alternation of generations. With these early sorts of plants, we have the production of these gametangia, the antheridium and the archegonium, which are really giving rise to gametes for these sorts of plants. An additional adaptation to these new land sorts of environments are what are known as apical meristems. So this is tissue that is continuously growing that allows for the development of roots and shoots and things like that to explore into these new habitats. This organization allows for the sort of exploitation of otherwise rather difficult habitats for these sorts of plants, and so we see this development of these apical meristems in these plants as they're moving towards land. Other adaptations that we see plants developing in response to moving towards these terrestrial habitats include the ability to grow bigger. Like competing for light resources in these new habitats becomes a fierce competition for these plants, and the plants that are able to adapt and develop, say, things like vascular tissue, the xylem and the phloem, and things like that, those plants gain an advantage because they are growing taller than their neighbors and absorbing more energy for their development and growth. We also see the development of waxy cuticles. So this waxy substance covers leaves and other structures to prevent water loss. Again, water loss is a major environmental constraint for plants in these new habitats. We also see the development of other pigmentation associated with UV protection, the carotenoids and the flavonoids, and so we really see these new and novel approaches to these new habitats. Also, what we see are different predators that evolve as well. Once we start moving animals from aquatic habitats onto land, these are new predators, and so, predators of plants, or herbivores. And so the development of sort of chemical warfare strategies to prevent predation is another adaptation that we see with plants as a response to moving towards these terrestrial habitats. When we're talking about the evolution of land plants, it's important to understand that this history is extremely deep. We have to look back a really long time, 500 million years or so, when we can start looking at the development of these vascular plants. This colonization of these land plants is an ancient part of the history of life on this planet. And so looking at these old species can give us clues as to the development or how these new species or current species have evolved. And some species have remained relatively unchanged over the eons, and some have made dramatic and radical changes. When we're looking at these different groups of organisms in the plant group, there's going to be a few major divisions, and if you look at figure 25.6, you'll get a good indication of what these sorts of divisions scientists use to describe the different plants. We can look and say, oh, well, we have land plants, and within the land plants we can have non-vascular plants, so we can have mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. We can have plants with vascular tissue. We can have, within that group, we can have plants with vascular tissue without seeds, or vascular tissue with seeds. So there's a lot of different variety within this plant group, and that's really what this class is about. All right, I'll put up another lecture for 25.2, and I'll talk at you later.